This is an NBC Palm Springs special report. Coronavirus facts, not fear. Presented by East Valley COVID-19 testing site, serving residents of Eastern Coachella Valley.
Joining us now is Jonathan Mehta Stein. He's Executive Director for California Common Cause. Back in early May, Governor Newsom issued an executive order to send mail-in ballots to all California's registered voters. He did this because of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and worries that polling places may not be safe come November. But soon after that, the Republican National Committee filed a lawsuit against the governor, saying the move was a power grab. Jonathan, thanks for being here. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of mail-in ballots. Why would the Republicans be so afraid of it? And is there any truth to what they claim, which is rampant fraud if we do it?
I think the Republican Party is moving against vote by mail, despite having no problem with vote by mail for decades, because of President Trump's new embrace of this idea, baseless idea, that vote by mail is rife with fraud. California has offered vote by mail to all voters who want it since 2002. There has been no notable vote by mail fraud. Several states, including a number of West Coast states, already mail a vote by mail ballot to every voter. None of them have had fraud scandals since the introduction of vote by mail for everyone. One national investigation of vote by mail from 2000 to 2012 found 491 cases of mail vote fraud, which might sound like a lot until you realize that over that time period, billions of votes were cast by mail successfully. So the rate of fraud is infinitesimal, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1%. And it's something we've embraced here in California. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Republicans realize that vote by mail works for everyone because Democratic and Republican secretaries of state around the nation have shifted to increasing access to vote by mail this year. They recognize that they need to give people a safe way to cast their ballot from home without having to go to a polling place that might put them at risk. And because study after study has shown that increasing access to vote by mail has no partisan valence, it doesn't help Democrats or Republicans. Both Democrat and Republican elections officials around the country have been increasing access to vote by mail.
Yeah, and of those states that you mentioned, Utah is one of them, a heavily Republican state, so certainly it hasn't slowed them down at all. In this age of COVID-19, which is what this show is about, is this not a reasonable reaction to keeping people from having to line up for hours, standing close to each other, close proximity? The poll workers always tend to be older Americans who are volunteering their time. Is there any logic for not adding it, especially during a time of COVID-19?
So you saw, or your viewers may have seen, Georgia's primary election earlier this week, in which people were waiting in lines for hours and hours and hours in order to cast their vote. We don't want to put, here in California, we don't want to put people in a position to choose between their health and their vote. We know that some communities are more vulnerable to COVID-19. Elderly voters, voters with disabilities, immunocompromised voters. We don't want those voters to be forced to choose between their health and putting potentially their family and their loved ones at risk, or casting their ballot. And that's why we want them to be able to cast a ballot from home, if that works for them. But we also know that Black and Latino communities have been hit hardest by COVID in California and around the nation. And we don't want an election system that systematically privileges some votes, but makes it harder for others. We want full access for everybody. And that's one reason why you see states around the country, as you noted, including Republican states, moving to increase access to vote by mail.
Is it not time, some 230 years after the Constitution was written, to completely overhaul the way we do elections? The idea that we do it on Tuesday because it's in the Constitution. Well, it was in the Constitution because that's when farmers went to town. In 1780, that was fine. That seemed important. It seems less important now. Or at least the idea of making it a national holiday or moving it to a Saturday so you could inherently get more people involved. Also stretching it out over a few days. So again, you're not getting, like in Georgia, 16,000 people using one polling site because they eliminated the 79 others that had been available to them in that district. Is it time that we completely overhaul how we vote?
There are some obvious moves that would make voting easier across the country. So, for example, there's no reason why we vote on just one day and that day is a Tuesday. No common sense reason in 2020. We should have nationwide early voting where people can vote over the weekend if that makes more sense for them. Some communities and some voters they're working folks and they can't take time off on a Tuesday, or it's really hard for them to take time off on a Tuesday. There's no reason why we shouldn't have early voting across the country that includes at a minimum the Saturday and Sunday and Monday before election day. There's no reason why we need voter registration as is typically understood. Government agencies like the DMV have records on almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody, and can use those records to register people to vote at their current address. Automatic voter registration facilitated through the DMV and other government agencies should be mandatory across the entire country. These are common sense reform that would make it easier to register to vote and easier to vote. Now, that's not going to solve all the problems. In California, we have done a lot to make it easier to vote. We have automatic voter registration in California. We have made it easier to access a vote by mail ballot. We are beginning to introduce same-day voter registration and vote and early voting. And yet in California, we have very severe voter participation disparities on the basis of race and the basis of age, with Latino and Asian American voters in most elections voting at close to half the rate of the rest of the electorate. And so it is not the case that simply by making voting easier, lowering legal barriers to voting, we're going to solve this problem. Those are necessary steps, but they're not sufficient steps. We also have to figure out how to communicate to communities across California that their vote matters and that engaging in democracy is worth their time and worth their investment.
Yeah, and there's always an outcry after the end of every at least major presidential election that the young people once again didn't show up. But again, it's a Tuesday in November. They have class, and they've removed most of the voting places or the polls from campuses all over the country. Why does it seem that there's an attempt, at least it seems like one, to minimize young voting and minimize minority voting? Because that's the way it feels when you start taking away polling places in those two places.
Certainly, if you look at the news across the country, it absolutely feels that way. And closing polling places in communities of color, resulting in long lines that keep people waiting to vote late into the night, it's absolutely a form of voter suppression. I'm happy to say that in California, we don't have instances of really targeted disenfranchisement in that way. Sometimes there are mistakes. If you saw LA County's election in March for the Super Tuesday, you saw really, really long lines. That was a product, we think, of malfunctioning machines that were being rolled out for the very first time, and a lack of poll worker familiarity with the new system that was, again, being rolled out for the first time. In California, elections officials aren't actively taking away opportunities to vote for communities of color and young people. But elections officials are not, they do not see it as their job of bringing into our democracy the communities that have long been left out and in many instances been frozen out. Their view is we administer a fair election with ballot security and we've done our job. It's on all of us to create a democracy and a voting culture that makes young people and people of color feel like their votes actually matter. If you look at the state of the world right now, you probably think to yourself, I've been voting and I don't see it making a difference. Or you look at our democracy and you say, this is the best you can offer me? Why would I participate? We have to build a democracy that is worthy of people's time, investment, and attention. And one of the ways in which we do that is not just talking about voting, we're talking about money in politics, talking about redistricting, and talking about all the different ways our democratic structures feel like they're rigged to regular people, so we can begin to level the playing field and make them feel like their democracy values their voice.
And I guess finally for me, if I can pay my taxes, receive my refund, or pay my taxes all online, if I can get my California driver's license online, if I can get my voter ID card online, is it not possible to come up with a safe way so that all Americans never have to go to another polling booth if they don't want to? Let's always have those for those that feel like that's part of their patriotic duty, but have the availability to simply go to their home computer, log in their social security number, and vote.
It would be great if we can get there. And frankly, the fact that our election systems feel like they're from another century pushes a lot of people towards that solution. The fact of the matter is that right now we're not there. And election security experts and cybersecurity experts will be the first to tell you, please do not vote online. It's been tried in some locations and in some countries. It has a terrible security track record. It is very actively vulnerable to hacking. We can't run, elections officials are often under-resourced, they're often stuck in their ways, and they're often working at the local level. We have devolved election administration down to the county level. Now, do you want those folks managing cybersecurity systems that keep our elections safe from the most sophisticated hackers in the world and the most sophisticated national enemies that we have who want to monkey with our elections and our election results? Right now, we just don't have an election system, and we don't have cybersecurity protocols that can allow us to move to online voting in a way that's safe. And cybersecurity experts who are big boosters of moving government functions online would be the first to tell you that. But my hope is that someday we get to a place where that is an option for the voters who want it, because it will finally feel like we're bringing our voting system into this country.
Right, which makes me wonder about those American Idol results. Were they real, or did somebody get on board? And then finally, as we come full circle, again, the biggest concern, at least for this one election in November, we saw in Wisconsin, they were forced to stand in line because they weren't allowed to do vote by mail. And there was a huge outbreak of those who had gone out to vote that day, especially among the poll workers. Are we going to see the ability for states to decide to allow, at least for this one election, people to vote by mail in as big a numbers as we've ever seen?
That's our hope. That's what we're fighting for. The reason why we have intervened in this lawsuit is to make sure that every single California voter can get a vote by mail ballot per the governor's executive order. And we're fighting this challenge from the Republican Party to make sure that every voter who wants to cast a vote by mail is able to do so. And in other states, they're going less far, but there is litigation across the country to increase access to vote by mail, and we'll see if they get to a place where California is right now. The key, let's remember that there are some people who want to vote in person. There's some communities, like the Latino community, that votes in person at dramatically higher rates than other communities. So we want to offer accessible and safe in-person voting locations for the folks who want it or the folks who need it. But we also want to make sure that every single voter can access a vote by mail vote if they want one. Expanding access to vote by mail in November, it's a common sense, nonpartisan way to ensure that voters can vote without going to a polling place that might put them or their loved ones at risk.
That's right. And we've been doing it since the Civil War, so I'm sure we can do it, and there'll be little to no fraud at all. Jonathan Mehta Stein, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be right back after the break.